The invasion began with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The Tarkari had seen it all before, primitive species cowering in fear as their ships blotted out the sky. They had conquered countless worlds, always encountering the same predictable resistance, outdated technology, weak defenses, and panicked civilians who believed they could negotiate or plead their way out of annihilation. Earth was no different, they thought. It was just another planet with inhabitants too primitive to pose any real threat. From the Tarkari flagship, Commander Zilk watched as Earth's cities fell into chaos. His soldiers were already on the ground, sweeping through major population centers. Earth's military had scrambled to defend their cities, but the Tarkari's advanced weapons made quick work of their attempts. Tanks, fighter jets, and missiles, all of them were rendered useless in the face of Tarkari energy shields and plasma weaponry. Zilk barely paid attention to the reports coming in. He had no reason to. This invasion was routine. The humans, as expected, were panicking. News broadcasts from Earth's media showed cities in flames, people fleeing for their lives, and soldiers making their last, desperate stands against the unstoppable force of the Tarkari war machine. It was almost disappointing to Zilk how easy it all was. The humans had fought with the best they had, but their best wasn't enough. Victory was assured, and soon Earth would be added to the ever-growing list of worlds conquered by the Tarkari. But then something strange happened. Reports began trickling in from Tarkari ground units about human resistance, but it wasn't the organized military that was fighting back. No, the humans had already lost most of their formal military assets. Instead, it was civilians, farmers, construction workers, engineers, who were starting to cause problems. At first, the reports were dismissed. What threat could a group of untrained, unarmed civilians possibly pose? But the reports didn't stop. In a rural region, a Tarkari patrol was ambushed by what they thought were harmless farmers. These humans had used tractors as makeshift tanks, outfitting them with sharpened metal blades and shields made from scrap metal. A few Tarkari soldiers had been taken out before reinforcements arrived. In another region, a group of civilians had rigged a construction crane to drop massive steel beams on a Tarkari landing site, crushing several Tarkari mechs before they could activate their energy shields. These were isolated incidents, but they were unusual enough to catch Zilk's attention. He reviewed the reports himself, trying to make sense of it. These weren't the actions of a terrified species blindly lashing out. There was a disturbing amount of coordination and ingenuity in these attacks. The humans were using whatever they could find, farm tools, construction vehicles, even household items, and turning them into weapons. And it wasn't just happening in isolated areas anymore. Across the globe, more and more reports of similar incidents were coming in. The humans weren't just fighting, they were adapting. Zilk called in his advisors. He wanted to know if these resistance efforts posed any real threat to the invasion. The answer he received was clear: no. These were just desperate acts from a species on the brink of defeat. There was no way a few makeshift weapons could turn the tide against the Tarkari's overwhelming technological advantage. Zilk nodded, reassured, but something in the back of his mind told him that they were missing something. The humans were unpredictable. That much was becoming clear. On the ground, Tarkari troops began encountering even more bizarre tactics. In urban areas, humans were using vehicles to barricade streets, turning them into makeshift fortresses. Public transportation buses, reinforced with metal sheets and concrete, became rolling battering rams, smashing through Tarkari patrols. Civilians with no formal training were rigging household appliances to create explosives. Ordinary tools were being used in ways that defied logic, and yet they were effective. A Tarkari squadron in a major city reported being lured into a trap where humans had rigged an entire building to collapse on top of them using nothing more than construction equipment and a few well-placed explosives. It was ingenious, crude, and terrifyingly effective. For the first time, Tarkari forces were suffering losses, not from a rival military, but from the very civilians they had dismissed as harmless. Zilk could no longer ignore the problem. He ordered a more thorough analysis of human behavior and their methods of resistance. What he discovered shocked him. The humans were not reacting out of desperation alone. They were thinking. They were using every resource available to them, no matter how mundane, and turning it into a weapon. Every new report brought more examples of their ingenuity. They had turned construction sites into battlefields, repurposed industrial equipment into war machines, and were even using outdated technology to disrupt Tarkari communications. The more Zilk read, the more uneasy he became. This wasn't just a ragtag resistance. The humans were turning the entire planet into a battlefield, and they were using everything at their disposal. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about fighting back with whatever they had, no matter how absurd it seemed. And it was working. Reports came in about human civilians using drones, simple hobbyist toys, originally designed for recreation, now equipped with homemade bombs and flown directly into Tarkari ships and troops. In another instance, a group of humans had hacked into an old satellite system and used it to jam Tarkari communications, leaving an entire battalion blind and cut off from their command. Every tactic the humans employed was unconventional, and that was what made it so dangerous. The Tarkari were used to fighting wars of technology, ships, energy weapons, shields. But the humans were fighting a war of survival, and in a war like that, everything was a potential weapon. It was a concept the Tarkari couldn't fully grasp. They had never encountered a species that could turn even the most mundane object into a tool for combat. The panic began to spread within the Tarkari ranks. Ground troops started reporting that they couldn't move through certain areas without being ambushed by civilians armed with tools, improvised weapons, and vehicles turned into battering rams. Soldiers were being picked off by humans who had repurposed hunting rifles and shotguns, weapons the Tarkari had thought were too primitive to be of any use. But in the hands of humans, even those outdated weapons became deadly. Zilk had no choice but to call an emergency meeting with his top advisors. The invasion was not going as planned. The humans were proving far more resourceful than anyone had anticipated. Worse, they were unpredictable. Every time the Tarkari adapted to one of their tactics, the humans came up with something new, something even more bizarre and effective. As Zilk listened to his advisors debate the best course of action, one thing became clear: the humans were not going to surrender. They weren't going to bow down or beg for mercy. They were going to fight, using every tool, every object, every piece of their planet, until the Tarkari either left or were destroyed. The realization sent a chill through the room. The Tarkari had come to Earth expecting an easy victory. What they had found instead was a species that refused to go quietly. A species that could turn everything, literally everything, into a weapon. As the invasion wore on, the Tarkari began to realize that their initial assessment of humanity had been a catastrophic mistake. What had started as isolated resistance quickly grew into a coordinated effort spanning continents. It wasn't just a matter of human military forces regrouping. It was the entire population adapting and joining the fight in ways that defied conventional warfare. In one region, Tarkari soldiers encountered a group of engineers who had repurposed civilian drones into a swarm of kamikaze attackers. These drones were never designed for combat, but that didn't matter. The humans had outfitted them with explosives scavenged from construction sites and sent them into Tarkari formations, blowing up entire squads before the aliens could react. The precision and speed with which these homemade weapons were deployed left the Tarkari reeling. They had no countermeasure for such improvised warfare, their shields and scanners built for a different kind of combat. Elsewhere, reports came in about humans using urban landscapes to their advantage. A group of civilians had taken over an abandoned industrial zone and converted it into a fortress. They used whatever materials they could find: old shipping containers, steel beams, and concrete barricades. What was once a mundane area for transporting goods became a death trap for any Tarkari who dared enter. The humans had rigged the entire place with traps, tripwires attached to grenades, tunnels lined with sharpened rebar, and walls ready to collapse on command. Alien forces walking into these areas often didn't walk out. The Tarkari found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They had fought advanced species before, but those wars were clean, battles fought between fleets and armies using high-tech weaponry. This was different. The humans weren't just fighting with guns and missiles. they were turning the environment itself into a weapon. Factories were transformed into war zones, vehicles became battering rams, and even public infrastructure like bridges and tunnels were used as choke points to ambush Tarkari forces. The psychological toll on the Tarkari troops was immense. Their advanced weaponry and armor, once their greatest advantage, now felt useless against an enemy that was fighting in ways they hadn't anticipated. Human civilians, farmers, laborers, engineers, were becoming more dangerous than they had thought possible. The invaders were used to facing structured military opposition, not a population capable of repurposing everything around them into tools of war. Silk, watching from the command ship, couldn't believe the reports. The more he read, the more he realized that the humans weren't just resilient, they were clever, unpredictable, and relentless. He had thought that his technologically superior forces would overwhelm Earth's defenses in days. Instead, his armies were being bogged down in a war of attrition against an enemy that turned every setback into a new strategy. Take the human hackers, for example. The Tarkari had relied on their sophisticated communication systems to coordinate their invasion. But the humans, using outdated and seemingly primitive technology, had found ways to infiltrate and disrupt those systems. They repurposed old radio frequencies and tapped into civilian satellites to block Tarkari signals, jamming communications at critical moments. In one case, a Tarkari fleet lost contact with ground forces for an entire day, allowing humans to launch a devastating ambush. Even more alarming were the human engineers and scientists who began to understand Tarkari technology. They scavenged fallen ships and broken equipment, learning how to reverse engineer alien devices and adapt them for their own use. In one region, a group of engineers managed to get a downed Tarkari mech operational again, only to turn it against its former owners. The sight of their own weaponry being used by the enemy was something the Tarkari were completely unprepared for. Everywhere the Tarkari turned, humans were fighting back in ways they never expected. Entire cities were evacuated and turned into elaborate traps, with rigged explosives and booby-trapped buildings waiting for unsuspecting Tarkari forces. Even water treatment plants were weaponized. Humans had figured out ways to poison or flood key areas by manipulating these systems, making it impossible for Tarkari troops to advance without falling into another deadly surprise. The sheer creativity of human resistance left Tarkari commanders baffled. In one engagement, Tarkari scouts entered what they thought was an abandoned warehouse. The building was empty, but just as they began to relax, the floor collapsed beneath them. Humans had rigged the foundation to give way, sending the alien soldiers plummeting into a pit lined with sharpened steel and debris. Those who survived were quickly taken down by a group of civilians wielding nothing more than hunting rifles and kitchen knives. It was the kind of close-quarters brutality the Tarkari were completely unprepared for. As the resistance grew bolder, so did their tactics. In several cities, humans commandeered large public transport vehicles, armoring them with scrap metal and turning them into mobile fortresses. These makeshift tanks, crewed by civilians, roamed through urban battlefields, smashing through Tarkari patrols. What had once been buses or garbage trucks were now formidable weapons of war. The Tarkari's energy weapons, designed to combat advanced military targets, had difficulty penetrating the thick, improvised armor. It was chaotic, brutal, and utterly effective. Zilk's advisors argued over how to respond to this evolving threat. Some advocated for more drastic measures, carpet bombing entire cities, using orbital strikes to wipe out resistance at the cost of human lives. But Zilk hesitated. The humans had already proven themselves capable of turning destruction into opportunity. Wiping out a city might remove a resistance stronghold, but it would also give humans more debris, more chaos, more opportunities to fight back with whatever remained. The Tarkari leadership was used to fighting wars of dominance, not wars of survival. Every strategy they had employed so far had been met with an unexpected and creative counterattack from the humans. And now, as the reports of Tarkari casualties continued to grow, the realization was dawning on them. They were no longer the hunters. The humans, in all their unpredictability, had become the hunters, using everything around them to strike back at the invaders. In one of the more rural regions, a Tarkari squad found themselves ambushed by nothing more than a group of human farmers. These weren't trained soldiers. They had no military-grade weapons, no armor. But they had something far more dangerous: the ability to adapt. Armed with pitchforks, modified vehicles, and shotguns, they had lured the Tarkari into a false sense of security, only to strike when the aliens were least prepared. It was a pattern that kept repeating across the globe, humans exploiting every possible weakness, every opportunity, every moment of overconfidence. The fear began to spread through the Tarkari ranks. Troops who had once been confident in their superiority now hesitated to move through forests or enter abandoned buildings. The humans had turned their planet into a death trap, and every step the Tarkari took felt like it could be their last. Even their most advanced technology couldn't save them from the relentless ingenuity of a species determined to survive. Zilk could see it happening, the unraveling of his forces. They were still stronger, still more advanced, but they were losing control. The humans weren't just reacting anymore. They were dictating the terms of the conflict, forcing the Tarkari to adapt to their guerrilla tactics. And for the first time since the invasion began, Zilk began to wonder if his forces were truly prepared for what they were facing. The humans were no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting to win. And they were turning the very fabric of their world into a weapon that the Tarkari couldn't escape. The invasion that had once seemed so inevitable was now slipping out of their grasp, and Zilk knew that unless something changed soon, the humans would have the upper hand. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. What had begun as a routine invasion had now become a full-scale disaster for the Tarkari. Their soldiers, trained to fight in conventional battles, found themselves outmatched by a species that had turned unpredictability into their greatest weapon. The humans' relentless innovation in the face of overwhelming odds had left the Tarkari scrambling for answers. The first real indication that the tide was turning came when the Tarkari lost control of several key cities. These urban areas, once thought to be secure, were now bastions of human resistance. The Tarkari had initially thought that by isolating these cities, they could starve the humans into submission. But instead of folding, the humans used the isolation to their advantage, turning the streets into labyrinths of traps and ambush points. Every alley, every rooftop, every corner held some new threat, and Tarkari troops found themselves out of their depth. One of the largest setbacks came when a Tarkari outpost in a major city was overrun. The humans had figured out how to reverse engineer parts of Tarkari energy shields and weaponry, turning captured equipment into makeshift defenses. They fortified buildings, using alien tech alongside their own, and the Tarkari discovered that their once impenetrable shields could be breached by their very own technology. It was a humiliating defeat, not because of the loss of territory, but because the humans had adapted so quickly and used the Tarkari's own strengths against them. Zilk was furious. He demanded answers from his advisors. How had this happened? How had a species that was supposed to be easy prey turned into such a formidable opponent? His advisors had no satisfying answers. Every new strategy the Tarkari implemented was countered by another round of human ingenuity. If they tried to overwhelm a position with brute force, the humans would vanish, only to strike again from a different direction. If they attempted to isolate the humans, they would find themselves outflanked by groups who had mastered guerrilla tactics with terrifying efficiency. The humans had turned warfare into an art of improvisation. They had no formal military structure left, but that didn't stop them from coordinating attacks that rivaled any organized army. In one instance, a Tarkari battalion stationed near a manufacturing district was systematically dismantled by a civilian force using repurposed factory equipment. The humans had converted assembly line machines into automatic turrets, created makeshift armor from industrial materials, and used forklifts and cranes as weapons to crush Tarkari vehicles. It was chaos, and the Tarkari had no idea how to respond to an enemy that could make a weapon out of anything. But it wasn't just physical warfare that was changing. The humans had also begun using psychological tactics, designed to keep the Tarkari on edge. It started with small things: false broadcasts that disrupted Tarkari communications, decoys that led patrols into traps, and disinformation campaigns that made it impossible to know which human strongholds were real and which were diversions. Soon, Tarkari soldiers were paranoid, hesitant to trust their own intelligence. They never knew if the buildings they entered were booby-trapped, if the roads they traveled were rigged to explode, or if the humans they saw were even part of the resistance, or just civilians lying in wait for the right moment to strike. The effect on morale was devastating. Tarkari forces that had once moved with confidence now hesitated at every turn. They began retreating from areas they once controlled, abandoning positions that had become too dangerous to hold. Silk, watching from the command ship, felt the shift in his forces. The panic was spreading, and with it, the realization that they were no longer the invincible conquerors they had believed themselves to be. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Silk ordered the use of more advanced weaponry. He authorized the deployment of the Tarkari's most devastating arsenal, hoping to crush the human resistance in one swift, brutal blow. Massive energy cannons were brought in, capable of leveling entire city blocks. Tarkari drones equipped with advanced AI were sent to hunt down human resistance fighters. For a brief moment, it seemed like the tide might turn again in the Tarkari's favor. But the humans adapted once more. They had anticipated the escalation and were ready for it. In one of the most coordinated efforts yet, human resistance groups across several cities launched simultaneous attacks on key Tarkari installations. They used their knowledge of Tarkari technology to sabotage the advanced weapons before they could be fully deployed. Factories that had been repurposed as Tarkari strongholds were blown apart from the inside, human saboteurs having infiltrated them weeks earlier and planted explosives in critical locations. In another city, humans hacked into the control systems of the Tarkari drones, reprogramming them to turn on their own forces. Tarkari soldiers were horrified as their once loyal machines began attacking them, mowing down entire squads before they could regain control. The humans had taken the Tarkari's most powerful weapons and used them against their creators, a move that shook the very core of the alien command. Silk's desperation grew. His forces were in disarray. What had once been a methodical conquest had devolved into chaos, with humans outthinking and outmaneuvering the Tarkari at every step. Even in space, Tarkari ships found themselves unable to maintain control over key orbital positions. Human engineers, having gained access to alien technology through downed ships, had begun launching crude but effective counterattacks from the ground. Makeshift rockets, built from salvaged alien tech and repurposed human missiles, were now targeting Tarkari fleets in low orbit. One by one, alien ships were forced to retreat, unable to deal with the relentless bombardment from below. Back on the ground, the situation was no better. Human forces, emboldened by their successes, began launching direct assaults on Tarkari command centers. These weren't military strikes. They were carried out by civilians who had no formal training, but who had learned through experience and necessity. They attacked in waves, using everything from modified construction vehicles to homemade explosives. Tarkari forces, once confident in their advanced defenses, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers and ingenuity. Silk watched in disbelief as his empire's grip on Earth crumbled. The humans had turned everything, their cities, their technology, their very planet, into a weapon. Nothing was safe anymore. The Tarkari, who had arrived with such confidence, were now the ones on the defensive, retreating from a species that refused to be conquered. And one final attempt to turn the tide, Silk called for a full-scale evacuation of key Tarkari forces, hoping to regroup and launch a decisive counterstrike. But it was too late. The humans had already cut off most of the escape routes, using their knowledge of the terrain and their mastery of improvisation to block Tarkari's ships from taking off. Ground forces were pinned down, trapped in cities that had become fortresses of resistance. As the reports flooded in, Silk knew that the invasion had failed. The humans had not only survived, they had thrived in the chaos, using every scrap of ingenuity, every ounce of determination, to fight back and reclaim their world. And now, as the Tarkari fled in disgrace, the realization hit him with full force: they had underestimated humanity, and that mistake had cost them everything. The invasion was over. The humans had won, not through brute strength or superior technology, but through their relentless adaptability. They had turned everything into a weapon, and in doing so, had defeated an enemy that thought itself invincible. The final days of the Tarkari invasion were marked by desperation. Zilk had exhausted every option, thrown every weapon and strategy at the humans, but nothing had worked. Each attempt to regain control had been met with failure, as the humans continued to evolve their tactics and fight back with a ferocity the Tarkari had never encountered before. The more advanced the alien technology, the more creatively humans turned it against them. It was as if every time the Tarkari escalated the conflict, the humans found a way to twist that escalation to their advantage. By now, the Tarkari fleet had been whittled down to a fraction of its original size. What had once been an armada capable of decimating planets was now scattered and disorganized, with ships falling out of orbit and being picked off one by one. Human engineers, who had learned from salvaged Tarkari ships, had developed crude anti-orbital weapons that were far more effective than Zilk could have predicted. These makeshift systems weren't elegant, but they didn't need to be. They were efficient and lethal. On the ground, the situation had grown even worse. What remained of the Tarkari ground forces had been forced into hiding, their once mighty war machines rendered useless by a lack of supplies and morale. Human resistance groups had seized control of critical locations, using the very infrastructure the Tarkari had relied upon to launch devastating counterattacks. Power grids, once hacked by the Tarkari to weaken the human defense, were now under human control again, and the aliens found themselves plunged into darkness, cut off from communication and power. Even the Tarkari's last-ditch efforts to use their most destructive weapons had failed. One attempt to launch an orbital bombardment on a human-controlled city ended in disaster when humans, having gained access to Tarkari codes, hijacked the bombardment systems. The energy blasts meant to flatten human strongholds instead turned on Tarkari forces, wiping out entire divisions before the fleet could shut down the compromised systems. It was a catastrophic failure, and Zilk knew then that the humans were no longer just fighting for survival. They were systematically dismantling the invasion. Zilk's command structure had collapsed. His advisors were gone, either dead in failed operations or taken down by human resistance fighters who had grown more and more adept at targeting high-ranking officials. What remained of the Tarkari leadership was scattered across the planet, cut off from one another, and struggling to stay alive. Tarkari soldiers, who had once marched into battle with arrogance and certainty, were now nothing more than terrified survivors, hiding in the ruins of the very cities they had helped destroy. For the first time in his career, Zilk felt true fear. The humans were no longer an abstract enemy to be conquered, they were a force of nature, unyielding and impossible to predict. They had taken everything the Tarkari had thrown at them and turned it into fuel for their fight. Zilk could no longer think of them as a primitive species. They had become something far more dangerous, a species that had learned how to adapt in ways the Tarkari could never have imagined. Zilk's final attempt to regroup came when he ordered the remnants of his fleet to gather at a hidden base deep within the mountains, far from the cities where the humans had taken control. It was his last hope, to regroup, resupply, and launch one final offensive to regain some measure of control. But even this plan was doomed to fail. The humans had already anticipated the move. They had spies and informants everywhere now, civilians who had once been terrified but were now deeply embedded in the resistance effort. The Tarkari had no way of knowing who they could trust anymore, and that uncertainty proved fatal. As the Tarkari regrouped at their secret base, the humans struck with a precision that left Zilk stunned. They didn't use conventional weapons. Instead, they deployed a mix of tactics that combined their newly acquired knowledge of Tarkari technology with the sheer force of their unconventional warfare. The humans used the terrain to their advantage, triggering controlled avalanches to bury supply lines and cutting off escape routes. Then, in a coordinated assault, they deployed drones, modified once again from civilian technology, that had been equipped with scavenged Tarkari weaponry. The drones struck hard and fast, targeting critical systems, and taking out the last remnants of the Tarkari's infrastructure. Zilk watched helplessly as his forces crumbled. The humans had made it clear that they weren't just trying to push the Tarkari off their planet, they were ensuring that the Tarkari would never come back. Each strike was calculated, designed to cripple the Tarkari so thoroughly that even retreat would be a challenge. The final blow came when the humans managed to infiltrate the base itself, using the very codes the Tarkari had once relied on for security. What followed was chaos. Tarkari soldiers, now out of options, attempted to flee, but there was nowhere left to run. The humans had them surrounded, and for the first time, Silk realized that his mighty invasion had become nothing more than a desperate retreat. He could no longer command his forces. The humans had taken over everything. Communications, transportation, even the air itself was no longer safe for the Tarkari. Their ships were being shot down as soon as they attempted to take off. In the end, Silk was left with nothing. His invasion, which had begun with the certainty of victory, had ended in complete and utter defeat. The humans, with their relentless ingenuity and refusal to surrender, had turned his forces into prey. And now, as the last of his ships were destroyed, he understood that the humans had done more than just fight back. They had rewritten the rules of warfare itself. The final days of the invasion were marked by silence. The humans didn't gloat, didn't broadcast their victory. They simply rebuilt. Silk had heard reports from surviving Tarkari soldiers about how the humans had already begun to reclaim their cities, repurpose Tarkari technology, and rebuild their infrastructure. The invasion was over, but for the humans, it seemed like just another chapter in their history of survival and adaptation. Silk, defeated and with no forces left to command, retreated to a hidden corner of the base, knowing there was no escape. He had failed. His empire had failed. The Tarkari, for all their technological superiority, had been undone by a species that had learned to turn everything, every scrap, every piece of technology, every fragment of their world, into a weapon. The humans had not only survived, they had thrived in the face of overwhelming odds. As the last remnants of the Tarkari fleet limped away from Earth, Silk couldn't shake the thought that they had encountered something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. Humanity had proven that it wasn't just a species of survivors. It was a species of fighters, innovators, and warriors who had turned their planet into a battlefield unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen.